At 6 in the morning, I was standing in my driveway watching $20,000 freeze, and for a beat I thought, well, that's a spectacular waste of money. Then I looked at the junction box and I realized somebody had been in my yard fiddled with live wires and gambled with fire and electrocution, so yeah, that whatever it was stopped being funny very fast. If you think neighborhood drama is petty, wait till you hear this one. I moved to Boulder about 8 months before this new job downtown, a nice 2-story place with solar panels, the whole adulting package. The heated driveway was my one indulgence. I grew up in Florida, and the idea of shoveling snow made me twitch, so I figured why not pay to never slip on ice again. 2 months after installation, on a night that dropped into the teens, I shuffled out at dawn to a sheet of ice and a system that claimed on its little digital face that everything was perfectly operational, but the concrete disagreed. My breath smoked in front of me as I went back inside for my phone, checked the controls, and then walked around to the side of the house where the electrical junction box lives, the place electrics go to be boring and reliable. The metal cover hung open like somebody had been in a hurry. Wires were pulled apart and taped off. Whoever did it knew just enough to separate things without frying themselves, except they didn't know enough to use the right tape or flip breakers, or not leave scorch marks where the insulation had arced. It was deliberate. It was dangerous. And for reasons I wasn't ready to believe yet, it felt personal. Footprints led away from the box into fresh powder, small, probably women's boots. I was halfway through dialing 911 when Tom from next door shuffled across his lawn. Tom's in his 60s, retired teacher, a neighbor who knows the history of every mailbox on our street. He looked at the open box and didn't blink. "Let me guess you had a visit from Brenda," he said. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like he was reading from a bad chapter in a neighborhood horror story. Brenda Morrison, H.O., a president, clipboard warrior, stylistic nightmare. She'd come by the afternoon before. Short haircut, puffy vest, a tablet like a shield. She told me my driveway was causing unacceptable increase in neighborhood energy consumption and demanded I disconnect it. I told her no. She told me I'd regret it. At the time, I thought she was bluffing. Turns out she wasn't even trying to bluff politely. Tom told me stories: a fountain drained while a family was on vacation, fines for planting vegetables out of sight, threats over a basketball hoop, and he didn't speak like someone exaggerating. He spoke like someone exhausted by a long, petty campaign. I called the police. Officer Martinez came, looked at the junction box, listened, and wrote everything down with a careful, quiet focus. "This is serious," she said. "Tampering with electrical systems isn't a prank. We'll investigate." While the officer talked to Brenda, who predictably said she'd only been inspecting, I called the electrician who installed the system. Gary from Mountain Peak Electric arrived, and I watched him go from professional concern to outright alarm. They were lucky, he said, kneeling close to the wiring. This could have killed someone. 200-amp circuit scorch marks tape not rated for electrical use. Whoever did this either got very lucky or knew more than they should. He took pictures and said he'd have to report the tampering to the state electrical board, which is when this stopped being a backyard spat and started being an ugly public safety thing. You never think that your silly neighbor dispute will wind up involving the Public Utilities Commission and the DA's office until it does. Mountain Peak filed the paperwork the PUC called, and the investigator Diana Peters showed up with the expression of someone who's seen more human stupidity than most people see in a lifetime. She spent an hour measuring, photographing, and asking questions. "This wasn't an accident," she said. "Someone had no business opening that box." She told me they'd pursue regulatory penalties if they found evidence of deliberate tampering. That's when I got mad, in the way people get when they've been threatened and then their house becomes a crime scene, slow, steady, and focused. I started documenting everything: photos, timestamps, copies of HOA violation records, forum posts, conversations with neighbors. What I found online and what Tom confirmed in person was worse than a single bad day. Under Brenda's leadership, the HOA had ballooned violation notices, fines, and petty enforcement. People paid to avoid fights or packed up and left. The community had been quietly wearing a leash. Gary reconnected the wiring that afternoon after making sure there was no hidden damage. He shook his head like someone who'd seen a near miss and didn't want to think about the alternative. My driveway warmed up. The ice melted, and I sat at my desk trying to work, while every ping of the phone felt like a drumbeat. The PUC calling Officer Martinez, updating me, mountain peak filing reports. I ordered security cameras that evening because it made me feel less stupid than doing nothing. What I didn't expect was how many people would come forward when someone finally did something about Brenda. You'd think people would be careful about speaking up, and at first they were, but once one neighbor started telling stories, others followed. A vegetable garden fined a mailbox post cited for the wrong beige, a kid's truck labeled commercial when it wasn't, the list went on. Enough people signed a petition, so a special HOA meeting got called, and the room at the community center filled with residents who were tired of being policed by someone with a personal vendetta. At the meeting, I stood up and laid the facts out: Brenda's visit, her threats, the tampering, the investigation. You could feel the room tilt. She tried to argue, to shout, to invoke bylaws she somehow thought she owned. People who lived here long enough, Tom, Linda, even a reluctant Gary, explained how she'd overstepped. We voted. 2/3 majority requirement met. The crowd voted her out as HOA president on the spot, which felt like ripping off a scab after it's been hurting for years. That should have been the end of a brief, painful story. Petty boss gets booted, but the legal wheels kept turning. Officer Martinez and the DA built a case matching footprints, Brenda's own admission she'd been on my property, testimony from Gary about the dangerous nature of the tampering, the PUC's investigation. When it went to trial, the evidence was stacked against her. On the stand, she tried to say she'd only been checking code and that the disconnection was accidental. The prosecutor made her explain how a non-electrician checking code ends up disconnecting wires and taping them with non-rated tape. The jury didn't buy it. Guilty on criminal tampering and criminal mischief. Sentencing included probation, community service, restitution for repairs, and in a move that surprised even me, a hefty fine from the Utilities Commission for risking public safety. There was a strange knot in my chest the day Brenda was led away. Accountability felt good, but watching someone's life fracture was not a scene I'd chosen for pleasure. Still, the result was necessary. She'd weaponized an office for personal control and gambled with people's safety. After Brenda, our HOA slowly remade itself. Reasonable people ran for the board, bylaws were clarified, processes introduced to prevent unilateral enforcement. We voted to audit the finances, and surprise, found payments disguised as community expenses that were frankly not community expenses at all. That opened another door: embezzlement charges, probation, revoked additional jail time. It turned out the person who demanded everyone obey the rules hadn't been playing by them either. And the neighborhood changed. We had town halls that actually solved problems, a community garden where there once was suspicion, and a barbecue where people laughed about things that didn't involve threats. I started a simple email newsletter to keep folks informed, mostly because I was tired of rumor-filling gaps. I ran for the board treasurer because someone who's lived through a mess should probably help prevent the next one. We passed bylaws that made it harder for a single personality to become tyrant in residence. Right now, a few winters later, the driveway still clears itself and snowflakes pile around it like something out of a postcard while the concrete stays bare, which is, I'll admit, pretty satisfying. But the real reward wasn't the comfort of dry boots. It was the change that followed. People took back the HOA, made it transparent, and turned it into the tool it was meant to be: an organization for shared problems, not a weapon for personal vendettas. Here's the part that stuck with me: standing up wasn't heroic. It was mostly inconvenient, uncomfortable, and a little scary. I had to talk to the DA, testify in court, and deal with neighbors who thought I'd gone too far. For all that, the lesson wasn't about bravado. It was about documentation, about small acts, adding up photos, timestamps, talking to people, organizing signatures. Bullies thrive where nobody keeps records. They lose when a community keeps its records straight and its voice loud. So if you ever find yourself deciding whether to do something about the person who's quietly making life worse for everybody, this is my advice document. Don't go alone and expect that the win will feel messy before it feels right. Justice isn't always a tidy instant. It's often paperwork, patience, and awkward town meetings. But it works. Now, I want to ask you something and be honest. When does community oversight become tyranny? When is it reasonable for neighbors to enforce standards, and when does enforcement turn into control? Tell me where you draw that line, or tell me a story where you had to stand up to someone like Brenda. Did you win? Did you walk away? Either way, share it, because our neighborhoods become better when people talk about what's fair and what isn't.